I just wanted to say real quick before I get into this next video, I wanted to thank all of the subscribers who have subscribed and watched my channel. I have just recently surpassed the 1,000 subscriber mark, and I want to thank each and every one of you who subscribed, and especially the ones who take the time to comment and to like the videos. It really means a lot. And as I finished up the story about the two missing women who went missing in Indiana, the exotic dancers, who were thought to maybe have possibly been murdered by this biker gang, this outlaw biker gang. And Amy Billig was born 1957. She was an American high school student who disappeared while hitchhiking to her father's art studio in Coconut Grove, Florida on March 5, 1974. She was 17 years old. Investigators believe Amy's disappearance was involuntary, and although there were no real leads to the exact circumstances surrounding her disappearance, unconfirmed leads indicate she may have been abducted by a motorcycle gang, most likely the Pagans. It's believed that she was drugged, raped, and murdered. Amy was born in New York in 1957. Her parents were Nathaniel Solomon and Susan Billig. Her father owned an art gallery, and her mother was an interior designer and art dealer. Amy would later be described as someone who might be described as a flower child. She was very much into nature. Her hobbies included playing the flute and guitar and writing poetry. She trained dolphins at the Miami Seaquarium, and she was very close to her mother. Due to the crime in New York, the Billigs decided to relocate to Coconut Grove, Florida in 1969. Amy graduated from high school in 1974 and wanted to become an actress. She was considering attending an acting academy in Florida. She didn't own a car, so she often hitchhiked in and around her neighborhood, but never for very long distances. She was known to hitchhike around the town when she needed a ride somewhere. At the time of her disappearance, Amy was 5'5" and weighed about 110 pounds. She had wavy waist-length, mid-brown hair. Now, here's the circumstances of her disappearance. On the afternoon of March the 5th, 1974, Amy returned home from school. She ate some yogurt and called her father to ask if she could borrow a couple of dollars to pay for lunch with some friends. Her father agreed, and Amy changed her clothes and began to hitchhike to her father's art gallery on Commodore Plaza to borrow the money. She was going to meet up with her friends later for lunch. She was seen by two construction workers hitchhiking close to her family's home. This would be the last known real sighting of Amy. She never arrived at her father's art gallery. At the time of her disappearance, Amy was wearing a denim miniskirt and cork platform sandals. This was well-known clothing worn in the 1970s. By that evening, Amy's mother and brother had become concerned when she failed to return home. This concern began when Amy's friends phoned to ask why she had not shown up to meet them for lunch. This confirmed their fears that something had happened, and they called the local police department. The police promised to investigate if Amy had not returned home by morning. Detective Michael Gonzalez informed Amy's mother, "Don't panic. If she isn't home by the morning, we will start to look for her." In the 1970s, I guess things were a little bit more Today, every teenager on the planet, basically, especially in the United States, carries a cell phone and is in constant contact. They have their location services turned on, so it's not too hard to find them if you haven't heard from them for a while. But in the 1970s, it wasn't unheard of for teenagers to go off and kind of do their own thing. And so maybe the police were just thinking this was a girl who just met up with someone, wanted to go out and have a little fun or hang out, and just didn't have a phone to call home. Now, the investigation began the next day when Susan called back to the police department to inform them that they had not heard from Amy and that she had not returned home. They began to question her friends and search the locations she was known to frequent. There were no results. Amy had few personal possessions on her at the time of her disappearance. Investigators concluded her disappearance was involuntary, and upon learning that Amy frequently hitchhiked, investigators theorized that she had probably been abducted. The sole item of physical evidence pertaining to Amy's disappearance discovered was her Instamatic camera. Her camera was discovered by a college student in the grass beside the Wildwood exit on Florida's Turnpike. This was 250 miles northwest of Miami. They processed the film in the camera, and it yielded nothing to really give them anything to show what might have happened to her along her route. Photographs did show a light-colored pickup truck parked in front of the wall of a building and another image of a white van. Amy's family hired a private investigator, but he was unable to come up with any conclusive leads. The family printed and distributed hundreds of missing persons posters. Flyers in both English and Spanish were distributed door to door and put up throughout public locations in South Florida. 5 days after Amy's disappearance, the first newspaper headline regarding her disappearance appeared in local newspapers. The headline revealed that both police and Amy's family suspected she had been kidnapped, possibly by members of a motorcycle gang. Police and Amy's mother, Susan, received several tips from individuals indicating that Amy had been abducted by members of either the Outlaw Motorcycle Club or the Pagan Motorcycle Club. These rival motorcycle gangs had traveled through the Coconut Grove area of Florida en route to an annual bike festival in Daytona on the day of Amy's disappearance. So there were quite a few of these bike clubs and bikers and people from out of town in the area at the time for this Daytona Bike Festival. They believed that this was very possible what happened to their daughter. A telephone tip from a girl who identified herself as Susan Johnson claimed that Amy had been abducted by the Outlaw Motorcycle Club. Shortly after that, a family friend telephoned saying that he had heard from a lawyer who had previously done legal work for the Outlaws Motorcycle Club of rumors of a teenage girl who had been taken from Miami. With the assistance of this lawyer, 2 of the motorcycle gang members visited the Billig household to hear pleas for their daughter's return. One of the individuals assured the mother that if their daughter was with the group, that she would be returned. But this didn't happen. In June of 1974, Susan learned from a convenience store manager in Orlando that a young woman who fit Amy's description had entered the store accompanied by 2 bikers. She said that they purchased some soup. 16 days after Amy's disappearance, her family received a phone call claiming she had been kidnapped and they were wanting a $30,000 ransom. Susan was able to come up with the funds and spoke to an individual on the phone that she was told was Amy and that she believed may have been Amy. They arranged to meet up at a hotel to exchange this money. The caller was arrested. When they met up at this hotel, the person that came there to pick up the money was arrested. And this was an extortion attempt by two 16-year-old brothers, Charles and Lawrence Glasser. They had no involvement in Amy's disappearance, but they were both arrested and charged with extortion. Shortly after the brothers' arrest, Amy's distraught mother once again addressed the media, asking for people to please stop prank calling because they really just wanted to find out what happened to their daughter. Within months of Amy's disappearance, the family once again received hoax phone calls from an unknown male who also identified himself as Johnson. This seemed to be a very popular name for these people. Maybe were being put up to this by the people that actually did take her. This person claimed that Amy had been abducted by members of an organized sex trafficking ring and that she was being held captive, and that Susan, her mother, would soon be kidnapped as well. Susan was told that her daughter only had 2 weeks left to live and that Amy's tongue was going to be cut out. In the years following their daughter's disappearance, the parents occasionally would go and speak to investigators and try to once again get her name out in the public. They continued to try to look into these motorcycle gangs, thinking that maybe she had left voluntarily with these people and maybe she was alive somewhere. In January of 1976, Susan's search was extended to Oklahoma when she got a tip from a gang member named David, who claimed that he had personally had contact with her daughter. The individual agreed to meet with Susan at her home, where he informed them that Amy was extremely timid and quiet like a mute. While in his company, he also described a scar that Amy had on her body that had not yet been disclosed to the media. This led the family to believe that he actually had contact with Amy. David agreed to contact the individual who currently had Amy, and several weeks later he contacted the family once again to inform them that Amy was in Tulsa. He claimed that he would soon locate Amy, and it just goes on to talk about how they went on back and forth with this, and he just kept claiming that someone else had Amy and that they were going to meet and bring Amy to them. But 5 weeks passed, and this David guy informs them that he had been retaliated against by this bike club and that they had broken his kneecaps and that they had taken Amy to Seattle, Washington to work as an exotic dancer. Which possibly could have been true because in the last story that I did, this same biker gang, this outlaw motorcycle club from Indiana, these two women were both exotic dancers, these two women that went missing. And at least one of them was involved in a relationship with one of these outlaw motorcycle gangs or members. And I believe that it's possible that these men, these gangs, controlled these dance clubs and controlled the women and probably acted as like, they were probably getting money, extorting money from these clubs. In 1985, a 33-year-old man named Alex informed a Pennsylvania police force that he had recently seen a missing persons poster of Amy, and he recognized her as a young woman that he knew named Terry Ann Warner, who had died of natural causes in Texas. And he said that her body had never been claimed by anybody. And so the Miami detective and a local dentist flew to Texas to examine the body, and they were able to, through dental records, find that this was not Amy. They went to psychics, and, psychics were a big thing. They were on all the TV talk shows, like, Montel Williams always had this psychic come on his show, and others like that. And they went to these different psychics, and they just gave them different theories about what had happened to her. They said one psychic told them that Amy had died at the hands of one lone man, and that he had raped her, and that her body was beneath water. According to this psychic, Amy's murderer had not meant to kill her, but that the struggle had become so intense and got out of hand that he had eventually killed her and disposed of her remains beneath a body of water. She claimed that this man still resided in Miami, Florida, and was haunted by his crime. And once again, they get one more hoax call with, once again, the name Johnson. This was in 1995. They were contacted. The man was a 48-year-old named Henry Johnson Blair, and he was married and had 2 daughters. And he worked in the United States Customs for 24 years. He was arrested and charged with 3 counts of aggravated stalking. He had begun to call the family and harass them, and he had been calling them for years and harassing them and making up false claims about Amy. And after all these years, they were finally able to trace his phone calls, and he was arrested, and he was charged with 2 counts of stalking, and he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. He admitted that he got sexual pleasure from hoax phone calls, and hearing the distress in the voices of the mother is the reason why he continued to call. He claimed that he was an alcoholic with obsessive-compulsive disorder. So 6 weeks prior to Amy's disappearance, she was known to have written in her journal about a man she called Hank. She claimed that Hank had asked her to accompany him to South America. Although the entry indicates she told him he was crazy, due to Henry Blair's nickname being Hank, his van strongly resembled one depicted in a photograph on Amy's camera, and his job required him to temporarily visit South America. Around the time Amy wrote in her journal about this, some believe that this man may have actually been responsible for Amy's abduction. They believe that he was able to take her across the border into Mexico because he worked for the Customs Department, and he probably knew how to get around this. Now, prior to his death, a high-ranking member of the Pagans named Paul Branch confessed that members of his motorcycle gang were responsible for Amy's abduction and murder. This deathbed confession was given to his wife shortly before he died in 1997. Reportedly, he had chosen to confide Amy's murder and abduction and murder to his wife as he was about to die. According to his confession, he told his wife that Amy had been abducted and taken to a party in the Everglades, where the Pagans had a trailer clubhouse set up. According to the confession, Amy had insulted some of the members of the gang, and therefore she was gang raped by approximately 24 members. They subdued her with drugs, and they repeatedly injected her with drugs until she overdosed and died. He says that Amy died within hours of having been brought to this clubhouse, and that her body was disposed of in a swamp. Branch himself had repeatedly been questioned by investigators in the years following Amy's disappearance, and he always denied knowing anything about her. And he was even one of the men that came to the parents and spoke to them and said that if they found out that one of their gang members had Amy, that she would be returned. His confession also named one other individual who participated in Amy's murder. Now, see here it says that Amy was murdered, and then he tried to play it off like she had an overdose, which of course she was being forced against her will, injected with drugs, and therefore she overdosed. Police believed this confession, and Jack Calver, I guess he was the lead detective on the case, stated numerous details that Branch had provided in his confession that no one else would have known about Amy. Amy's mother, Susan, spent her entire lifetime, the rest of her lifetime, searching for her daughter. She went to death row and spoke to prisoners on death row. She went and spoke to motorcycle gangs. She spoke to people who had been involved with motorcycle gangs. She went as far as Washington, Oklahoma, Nevada, and Texas, and even traveled to England in search of her daughter. Susan refused to abandon the hope of locating Amy. She and her husband closed their art gallery, sold most of their possessions, moved into a smaller home, and they spent all their finances in search of their daughter. And even though they were unable to find what happened to Amy, they did help several other girls and women who had been abducted and abused by these motorcycle gangs. For 20 years, Susan refused to abandon searching for her daughter. She always told herself, tomorrow is going to be the day that I find her. She believed that Amy had been drugged, turned into either a prostitute or a dancer, and was being forced in these dance clubs. By 1998, Amy's mother and brother had accepted that she was deceased. On March 8th, Susan invited several friends to have a private memorial service for Amy. She said that she had a sense of peace after the ceremony, and that she felt like that Amy had been waiting for so long for her to finally just accept that she was gone, and that it was cathartic for her to have this ceremony. It allowed her to finally accept what she had refused to believe. She wrote a book detailing the disappearance of her daughter, the disappearance of Amy Billig, A Mother's Search for Justice. And she just, this became her life, her work throughout her life. Amy's father, Nathaniel, died of lung cancer in the early 1990s. His final words were of his desire to see his daughter. Susan died of a heart attack in 2005 at the age of 80 following a long battle with lung cancer. Her son Joshua had provided his mother with 2 granddaughters, and they were very close to her. And so this man confessed to this on his deathbed. Police took this at face value, that her body was buried in a swamp or dumped into a swamp. The deathbed confession of a former gang member may finally have shed light on what happened to 17-year-old Amy Billig, who went missing in 1974. Now, this Paul Branch, who was an enforcer for the Pagans Motorcycle Club, died in his home near Charlottesville, Virginia. And as his life came to an end, he confessed to his wife. So was anyone else there to hear this deathbed confession? His wife claims how long had he been married to this woman? Did she know about his involvement with this motorcycle club years earlier? Was he still involved in this motorcycle club? Did anyone else ever offer anything to say, yeah, he was telling the truth? Branch, who had been interviewed by police over the years, never admitted to knowing what happened to Amy. And his wife reported in December dozens of details consistent with information gathered by investigators. Amy's mother, who was then in her 70s, had crisscrossed the country searching for clues about her daughter. Based on hundreds of interviews and Branch's confession, Calver said he believes the story that Amy was picked up by the Pagans motorcycle group as she was hitchhiking about a mile away from her father's art studio. Now, this was a motorcycle gang, but apparently, according to him, they picked her up in a van. And she was a small girl, only 5 feet 5 and 102 pounds. So it was very easy for these motorcycle guys to just take her body and grab her and throw her into this car or van that they claim. And it says she became insulting. So here's my part, what I want to interject here. She became insulting to these bikers who were drugging and raping her. So this is this man's way of justifying them doing this to this girl. This is his way of justifying the reason why they killed her was because she, who they took against her will, drugged against her will, sexually assaulted numerous times by different men against her will. She was the one who insulted them, and therefore they had to kill her. But it's still kind of a mystery because he was the only one that ever spoke about it, and he was on his deathbed, according to his wife. And so that was the story that they went with about what had happened to Amy Billig. As I was talking about Amy Billig, I came across this article. This is an article about her brother, Josh. Now, Josh was only 1 year younger than Amy. When she went missing, he was around 16. And he talked about the long and lasting shadow of his sister's disappearance. Coconut Grove in the 60s and 70s was the subtropical capital of American counterculture. Hippie weed smokers gathered with tie-dyed vagabonds and free-spirited artisans. Now, Amy herself had been described as a free spirit. She was very artistic. She liked to play music and poetry. She wanted to be an actress. This is just coming out of this flower child era of the 60s. And her parents were artistic type people as well. And they had left New York because they were concerned about the crime rates and moved down to Florida. And I guess that they felt more secure and safe. Little did they know that Amy, their daughter, would become a target of, I personally believe, it's just my personal thoughts, that this whole story about this motorcycle deathbed confession maybe wasn't about Amy. Now, I may be wrong about that, and there may be people that truly believe that Amy was a victim of this motorcycle club, but the deathbed confession of this man is what leaves me wondering, because I asked the question, was anyone else there other than his wife? Some people believe, and I watched a video yesterday on YouTube about her and about her story, and some people believe that she was doing that in order to get some type of attention, to be able to maybe monetize on that story. I don't know, and I could be wrong, and she very well may be telling the truth. But I also have to believe that this man, this Henry Johnson Blair, who went by the nickname Hank, this was the man who was later arrested. He was later charged with harassment of her mother. He had been calling her for years. And finally, after so many years, he started using a cell phone. And this is when the police were able to find him and charge him. And Amy kept a diary. And in one of her diary entries, she talked about a man named Hank who had asked her to go with him to South America. And people believe that this was the man. Now, the day that she was to go to her father to get some money, the day that she disappeared, she had asked her dad to borrow some money, and she was going to hitchhike a mile to his art studio, art gallery, and she never made it. She was supposed to meet up with some friends later that day, and she never made it. This is what led people to believe that she had been abducted by this motorcycle gang because she was hitchhiking. I wonder if this Hank had been watching her, stalking her, and when he saw her come out of the house alone and start walking towards this place, if maybe he came along, pulled up and said, do you need a ride? Let me give you a ride. Amy's brother Josh described life before Amy's disappearance. His father had opened an art gallery, he says, and he would walk around downtown, going in and out of shops. He felt like he knew everybody. And there were Hare Krishnas that hung out in the park and on the streets and played music. And he describes it as just a fun place to be for a 16-year-old boy, just living life. And he says then suddenly everything changed on March the 5th, 1974, when his sister vanished without a trace. The Amy Billig case is an American tragedy. It's a troubling tale of uncertainty of what happened to this high school senior. It put their family in the spotlight that they never wanted to be in. Now, it describes here Amy was kidnapped while hitchhiking, goes one popular theory. She was seized by an outlaw motorcycle gang. She was raped and trafficked as a sex slave. She was murdered by a serial killer, and her body was cut up and fed to the alligators. Now, these are just different theories that people floated around over the years, and especially tall tales, so to speak, of people just wanting to, sensationalize this. But there's been a lot of stuff written about Amy over the years. A Miami Herald crime reporter named Edna Buchanan wrote a piece about Amy called "The Corpse Had a Familiar Face." She was beautiful, although she didn't know it yet. She was warm and talented. She wrote playful, pretty poetry and dabbled in watercolors. She excelled at the flute and guitar, a budding feminist and a voracious reader. She loved Chinese food and clothes from secondhand stores. And she's describing Amy as just this kind of flower child type girl who's coming into... They're coming out of the 60s with this whole movement and getting into the women's rights movement and the equal rights movement. And Amy's a young teenage girl at the height of all of this. And just living in this town where everybody pretty much trusted their kids to be able to get out and, explore. And for 20 years, Amy's mother was tormented by one persistent caller who claimed he was holding Amy captive and seemed to get this sadistic thrill out of describing how he abused Amy. The man, named Henry Blair, was a former U.S. Customs agent. He was convicted in 1996 of 2 counts of misdemeanor stalking. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison and settled a civil lawsuit where he was ordered to pay the family $5 million. He made 2 annual payments of $10,000, Josh Billig says, before he died. So he'd paid the family $20,000 of a $5 million settlement. Josh says after this happened to Amy, he started to get death threats. He said, I got threatened all the time. I had to start carrying a gun at the age of 17. I was very paranoid. So his life went from this carefree young teenage boy living in Florida, where everything's just kind of free and open, and the family are artistic type people who kind of are into music and art, and then he goes to being this young boy who's having to drop out of high school because of these threats and all this talk about his sister. He's having to carry a gun. He says he began to smoke marijuana, and he became very emotional. I probably didn't know that my life was changing. The older I got, the more I saw how it affected my life. The hardest thing about it was you never had any closure. You just go through life thinking maybe something will happen. Maybe you'll get some news. Josh is now 66 years old, and eventually he regained his equilibrium. He got his GED and got back involved in the Boy Scouts. It's something that he had been involved in before Amy's disappearance, and because of what was going on in his life, he kind of just got away from the Boy Scouts and started smoking pot. But he got back involved in the Boy Scouts, and he took community college classes, and he became a stonemason, and now his work can be seen all around South Florida. And he built a Keystone bench in Coconut Grove's Peacock Park that is nestled beneath palm trees, and he dedicated it to his sister. There's a photograph of him here. And he just says he remains haunted by this event that happened in their life, and the fact that they had all these different stories. And he says Amy would be 67 today. I wonder often about what her life would have been like. He says he still gets calls. He still gets calls from people with these theories, and people calling to claim that they know where Amy is or what happened to her. And he says for years he continued to pay for his mother's phone line. And then he eventually switched that phone number over to a cell phone so that he could keep up with that phone in case Amy did call, because he just didn't know. And Susan Billig, Amy's mother, died without ever getting any kind of closure. But shortly before her death, she decided to have Amy's name etched into the family's gravestone in Graceland Memorial Park. So she put Amy's date of birth and the day she went missing, March 5th, 1974. Josh says he doesn't believe his mother ever accepted that Amy may have been dead, because she spent all of her life, even though she had lung cancer and breast cancer and 2 heart attacks, and she had spent her life searching for Amy and traveling around the world to, find out clues, or people had called in tips, or so this is just kind of how I wanted to wrap this story up, to just say, with all the crazy theories and the crazy people who come up with these calls to torment this family, or to maybe even to offer this family some hope, and the psychics and all that the police, the leads that the police followed, nothing ever really came of it, and Amy's body's never been discovered. Many people choose to believe this outlaw biker gang theory, but once again, I'll just say my own personal thoughts is that this man, he either had something to do with Amy's disappearance, or he was just somebody who was so obsessed with her that even through 20 years, he couldn't stop tormenting the family about it. Thanks for watching.